this is my final week here at the archives. I'm retiring, I'm old enough now, and you'll be still seeing me. I'll be here as one of our many great volunteers. But it has been my great privilege to spend the last 2 years working on the Smithers photograph collection with our many volunteers that helped with that project. And they were so faithful. You'll get to see some fabulous images that the volunteers, when they were working on them, never got to see. They worked down in a cold, dark room downstairs, and all they got to look at were the negatives. So after a year and a half, we were finally reaching the end of processing all these negatives, getting them put in their sleeves, where these little volunteers had been working away. And we asked them if they would like to present some of these photos to the public. So the presentation I'm giving today was actually photos that Barb and Reno Parker, 2 of our volunteers, were given the topic of feeding Butte. How was a city the size of Butte, up here where not much food is produced, how was it fed? And they accumulated this, going through the Smithers photos, pulled these many pictures, and there were so many of them, we decided to split it in 2. So this one is about feeding Butte in hard times, and I'm so sorry that Barb and Reno couldn't be here to see the fruits of their labors, but I thank them very much for the work that they did. I'm going to go kind of chronologically, so I'm going to start with the Joshers Club. And here are the Joshers in the 1920s. This picture was probably taken around 1926 maybe. The building in the background is the Grand Hotel building. If you can see the address and the little logo on it. I'll tell you that the Joshers Club was started on Christmas Eve in 1903. A bunch of men were sitting around a table at the back of Al Green's cigar store in the back room, and they were drinking and celebrating Christmas Eve. And a messenger came in, and he had a note, and he asked for Billy Gamel. And so Billy was a well-known guy, very popular with this group of men that liked to gather and smoke their cigars. And he was a single man. He'd never married, he never had any children. And the note that was handed to him said there was a family in dire straits with no food. And his friends were always pulling pranks on him. And so he looked at this note and he thought, this is another one of their pranks, to send me out on Christmas Eve when I could be sitting here warm and drinking, to send me out into the cold. And so he said to his friends, this is probably a Josh, but I'm going to go and see about it anyway. And so Al Green, whose building they were meeting in, was one of the few car owners in Butte in 1903. He had a Stanley steamer. And so he and a couple of the friends that were gathered around him piled into the Stanley steamer and drove to this address. And there they found a widow and her 5 or 6 children who not only had no food in the house, they had no heat, and they had broken up all their furniture to burn to keep warm. So there were no beds to sleep on, there was nothing. They were beyond destitute. And so Billy Gamel went back up to Al Green's buffet, he passed the hat, he and his buddies went out and bought food and bought beds and bought fuel and took care of one family on Christmas Eve in 1903. And by the next year they said, I bet there's other families like this. And so the Joshers Club, named because the first one he thought was a Josh, and they were always joshing. And it was never really a club. They never had bylaws, they never had meetings, they never had a regular schedule. They just every year got together and did this thing at Christmas time. And somebody last night when I gave the presentation asked me if my timing of this talk was because this Saturday is the Thompson food drive. And I said, no, really, it's just when there happened to be an opening on the schedule and I got put in. But I would very much compare what the Joshers Club did to what the Thompson family and Thompson's Distributing does today, with the exception of now the food that they gather goes into a food bank that's there year-round, where in these days it went into a central location, and then right before Christmas they got everybody who had a vehicle that would help, and they drove the food in boxes and baskets. So this is Billy Gamel. This picture appeared in the paper with his obituary. He never married, he didn't have a family. He lived on the 5th floor of the Silver Bow block, which is now gone. And there was a fire on the top floor, and he felt trapped. He was at the window for like 10 minutes. The firemen could see him. They were trying to get to where he was to rescue him. And he finally felt that they weren't going to get there in time. So he threw a mattress out the window, and then he wrapped himself in blankets and a big comforter, and he jumped, and he broke his neck and died. That was in 1927. He'd already been doing the Joshers Club for more than 20 years at the time of his death. So here is a different year and a different location. So every year they found a different empty building to work out of. Whatever building was vacant, people were very generous in giving to them. So I'm sure they just had to contact the owner of a vacant building, and he said, sure, use my space. And there are the men inside, looks kind of like a food bank today, sorting all the donations, putting them in place. What?
No, it's fine now. Yeah.
And here they are back in the same room. More donations have now come in, and the boxes are being assembled in the middle of the room. And you can see that they called them food baskets, but they weren't exactly a basket. They were a big wooden box. And the newspaper reported that this was the contents of a food basket in 1928. So now what's it doing? It's just going on its own. I'm out of control. So I hope you got to see that slide that told how many. It's going on its own. All right, what about that? Slideshow speed.
Click on loop and undo the.
Now how do I go back?
There.
It's just going on its own. Don't you love technology?
Is it still going on its own?
It's slideshow speed slow, so I want to go to loop. I don't want it to do anything. I want myself to have control.
Yes.
I don't have control.
I think you have to.
Oh, you're getting a good preview of what's coming up, folks. Exit. There we go. Now I can go backwards. I didn't hear you back there.
There we go. There we go. You're good now.
There we go. Keep my hands off the computer. So here's the contents. This was, in the newspaper, and the Joshers Club. So this is the year after Billy Gamel died, and they wanted let people know they were still operating, and they got good publicity. The 1928 food basket contained 24 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of sugar, 50 pounds of potatoes, 3 pounds of beans, 5 pounds of oatmeal, 18 apples and 12 oranges, 1 pound of coffee, a half a pound of tea, a butt of bacon, 8 pounds of fresh pork, and 10 pounds of fresh beef. And I wondered in 1928 when needy people might not have had a refrigerator, what they did with all that fresh meat. And it really was fresh. You can see the fresh meat there. There is a big chunk of fresh meat, and down here, so one of those is probably the pork, and one is probably the beef. And so so Smithers took these pictures, and many of them showed up. He he sometimes worked as a photographer for the papers, and sometimes he just contracted with them. He'd know he had a good picture, or maybe the organization was, somebody in the Joshers would call him and say, will you take pictures of our event? He'd go take the pictures, and the Joshers would take this to the Montana Standard and say, we want this published, whatever. But many, many of his pictures, we're so thankful, because Smithers wasn't very good about writing what the picture was about on his envelopes, and we have had to put a lot of research into telling the stories behind these pictures. And when they show up in the newspapers, we're so very thankful. So this was the 1930 food drive, and the empty location they're in right now is in the old Beehive block, which was on East Broadway Street, between the Montana Power Company and the Acoma Lounge. It was in there, and it's still standing, but it's now behind the facade of the Northwestern Energy building. So you can see these are all volunteers, all recruits. This picture appeared in the newspaper as well, and I was really happy because I thought it had to do with the food drive because it was in the same envelope. And sure enough, this one year in 1930, they heard of a family that was lived outside of Butte in the hills near Divide, and they went to see the family, and the father of the family was a World War I veteran who had been gassed in the war, so he was disabled. He was unable to hold down a full-time job, but he was trying to provide for his family with this little farm acreage that he had. And here they were snowbound, no way to get out. His horse had died, he could not get to town anymore. And so the Joshers Club members drove as far as they could in one of their vehicles, and then they got on snowshoes and took food and gifts for the small children and snowshoed it up to this isolated family. And there is another picture taken at that location, this fancy doorway that you see, that's the doorway into the Beehive block. And different businesses were on both sides of it. It was a pretty big block, and so each side of it had a business in it. And one side of it was vacant this particular year, and so there they were. Metropolitan Meat Mart were always featured in the photos of this big Joshers Club food drive. That they, I think the beef were donated by ranchers and cattlemen, and Metropolitan Meat Market donated the labor to divvy it up to go in the food boxes. Oh yeah, I had to throw this in because so just so you could see where it is. So there's the Beehive block right there where they were doing this. And this building and this building are now behind the Northwestern Energy facade, as well as their original 40 East Broadway building. And there's a little edge of the Acoma. Okay. I just like to know these things because when I see people standing near a doorway, I'm always going, what cool building is that? And so I had to look it up, so I'm sharing what I know. What happened to my little slide for this? There it is. The Rotary Club, that was the women's auxiliary of the Rotary Club. And early on in their inception, they decided that the thing they would, oh, there I've done that thing again. You don't want to do that. Okay. Exit. So I'm hitting the magic button that puts me into slideshow mode, which I don't want to do. Isn't technology great? So it is about the Rotana Milk Fund, and so the earliest mention of it that I found was early in the 1920s, and this picture was in the Smithers collection, and you can see how in the early days of their organization, how they distributed the milk. The children came with big pails from home, and the women poured it from these big 5-gallon milk cans and poured it into pails to take home. And there's the slide. And they held fundraisers to raise the money for this. So this is the Rotana Milk Fund Dance, and I think this one is held in 1926, dancing at the Winter Garden. So every year they had a fundraiser to raise the money to buy the milk. And then as they, and then by late 1920s, and this picture appeared in the newspaper, so we knew exactly what it was. The Rotana Club was bringing milk bottles to school and straws and making sure that the school children got the milk every day, and for some reason they felt that was a better way to get the milk into every child than having children bring the pails from home, because some needy families might not have had a clean pail to send up there. I don't know. But this was a Rotana Club project that carried on for many, many years. You know, back in the 1980s, my next door neighbor was a longtime Rotana Club member, and that was one of the things she said to me. We took care of making sure that the children of Butte got milk. So now, I don't know why my title slides are one off, because technology. So now we're going to move into the 1930s, and the Hansen Packing Company, and FERA stood for Federal Emergency Relief Association or Agency, those letter things. They were the forerunner of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which you know, the many government agencies that during the years of the Great Depression created these agencies to give people employment and to provide relief to the hundreds of thousands of people that were out of jobs or were losing their farms. So this Hansen Packing, I found in the newspapers that in the 1930s, in 1930, they had been given a government contract to provide beef to the U.S. Navy. So I think that's probably how they got to be on the government's radar as a place that could process large amounts of beef and get it supplied, and they canned it. And so, when 1934 came along, and they just geared this up, you know, early in 1934. By July of 1934, Hansen Packing was located right on a rail line, and truckloads of cattle and horses that farmers and ranchers could not feed. It was a drought. There wasn't enough feed. They had no money. There was no way to take care of their livestock, and so they began sending it to Butte on rail cars. And this picture of Hansen Packing kind of shows the setting. There's, you know, a big pen up on the hillside. This is Timber Butte, and up on the hillside you can see the old building that was Clark's Mill. So William A. Clark, that was where his ore went to be processed in the early days. And in 1934 it was still standing there. So in these first pictures, you're going to see the condition of the cattle that came in, and their bones just showing through their skin. And they didn't put them out in feedlots to fatten them up. There was no food to fatten them up with. They were shipped in and they were processed almost immediately. Another picture of the cattle in their pens. Okay, we got horses in their pens, same thing. Horses in just starving condition, and they're being brought to Hansen Packing to be processed as well. And there's another overview that shows Clark's Mill and the buildings. At this time, you know, they were processing the meat in the old meat packing plant, but they also built a huge building as a tannery, because you didn't waste anything in the middle of the Big Depression. So the federal government found a guy in the Midwest who had, his family had been in the tannery business for years. They brought him to Butte. He designed how the building would be set up. He trained all the men, he trained the supervisors, and they hired hundreds of men at the tannery as well to process all these hides, sheep, cows, horses. And those photos are also in the Smithers collection, but they're not part of Food Relief, so they didn't end up in this presentation. And so there you see all the different kinds of animals sorted into pens just outside the big slaughterhouse building. And you can see some of the land to the north of it, which is going to show up in pictures in just a minute. And well, there's the horses, just like the one we saw at the cows. So this one, there we go. I put a little caption under it. So this picture appeared in the paper July 15th, 1934. So the operation is totally up and running by mid-July, and they have already hired 700 FERA workers, and you can see a lot of women were there as well as men. And these were all Butte. They didn't bring in workers from someplace else that were out of work. Butte's population, the Depression, miners were laid off. I think they had a strike going on in the middle of the summer in this year, and women were often the sole support of their families. So both men and women got jobs in this big operation, all from Silver Bow County. And this was just a mind-boggling number to me that appeared in the paper. They were able to process 275,000 pounds every 24 hours in this new operation. And as it was just getting started, they had already employed 700 workers, and this is just part of them. They were working in shifts, and they hoped to, they were planning to raise that number up to possibly as many as 2,000, is what that newspaper article said. So here we are. The first part of the process is just getting the animals in and getting the hides off. So these are just, we'll see several pictures that just show the massive size of the operation and the many people at work. You see guys in nice white suits. They were men that were more experienced, and they were supervising the many new FERA employees to make sure that everything was done well. Big carcass hanging there. And here the guys are taking all the meat off the bones, and it's going onto these big tables, but you know, you just see the huge amount of men, the little supervisors making sure it's all done good. Their little white coveralls are always spotless. Music, or the meat goes into these big bins to go to the next station in the processing. And Hansen had these huge meat, refrigerated meat rooms, and so you see many pictures of this where there's just lines and lines and lines of animals hanging on hooks. I chose this particular picture because there were guys in it, you know, on their little raised things, doing whatever they're doing. That one is pigs. They look a little bit better stuffed than the cows and horses did. So now we're in, I believe this is sausage stuffing. So there we have the guys and ladies. So now you see some ladies. These are ladies along the back of this counter in the sausage stuffing room. Now there's a meat grinder that every lady wishes she had in her kitchen. If you're the age of myself or my mother, you would know that the meat grinders we had in our kitchens looked a lot like that, only smaller. And so this, I don't know if this is meat that is headed to be put in cans or what they're doing, but again, you know, now that we're not handling the big carcasses, we have lots of ladies employed as well, doing different steps in the job, and always those supervisors making, you know, up where they can see what's going on. And here we have one of the end products, boiled beef, not to be sold, Montana Relief Commission. So all the food that they were doing at Hansen's Packing, in this batch anyway, stayed in Montana. It was Montana cattle that stayed in Montana to feed Montanans all over the state, not just in Butte. And the other byproduct, here's the horses, Vitamont horse meat product. And down in big letters it says dog food, and underneath it says fit for human food. So if you were a little bit, it was still perfectly edible, and it was processed under the same sanitary conditions, but it was horse meat instead of cattle, and some people would have had an objection to eating that, so it was labeled as dog food, but it was fit for human food. Okay, so the Silver Bow County Relief Association actually came into existence before that Hansen Packing Plant got going. They started up, their first mention of them in the newspapers is in 1931. And I found them when I was looking for how long did the Joshers Club keep going after the death of Billy Gamel in 1927. So they did it in 1927 after he died, in 28, 29, and 30. By this time, James T. Finland of the Finland Hotel was the head guy of the Joshers Club, but in one of the newspapers it reported that he was in bad health. Oh, the Joshers Club also started putting on a fundraiser, and it was a big vaudeville show every December, and they would, so James T. Finland, although he was in poor health, came back for the vaudeville show and to thank people, and was given a standing ovation. People were so happy to see him. But in 1931, a newspaper article appeared that the Joshers Club would not be distributing food baskets that year because the Silver Bow County Relief Association was taking over that work. So the Silver Bow County Relief Association was formed, and in 1931, it might have been there earlier, but 31 was the year that they became pretty big. I'm thinking that this hothouse operation might have been equivalent to Hansen Packing, because the photos that we see are the fields south of Hansen Packing. But you look at the fields and what they were able to produce in Butte, Montana, and you're amazed. And I think part of it is because there was this great greenhouse. And somebody last night asked me if I knew where this greenhouse was located, and I didn't. And so if any of you have any information about where this big greenhouse was located, and did it then become the greenhouses that were out on the flats that, became kind of a private entity after the Great Depression, I don't know. And so here we see the timber buttes in the background, and the fields in front of, on this side and to the north of Hansen Packing, leading up towards town. And they might have been feedlots. They might have been, in prior years, used to fatten up the cattle and well-fertilized ground. I'm not sure. But there were big, big acres of land that were then planted as relief gardens. And these relief gardens were being planted in cities across the nation to help feed hungry people and to feed them healthy food. And back in those days, they didn't have freezers. You couldn't give them frozen corn and frozen peas. And so these gardens were pretty important to provide nutrition to needy families. And you can see how spectacularly big, there's the corn over there. And pretty hard to grow corn like that in Butte, Montana in most years.
Good luck.
Yeah. And so this look at the garden is either very early in the season, there's no leaves on the trees, and the guys are out there tending early plants, or it's very late in the season and they're out there harvesting the last of what's left. But there's Butte in the background, the Butte Hill, and I think the next shot you can see the Big M over here. So that's where these fields are located, and There's some harvesters here in the front, and we can see that this one is definitely autumn because they're harvesting various squashes and gourds and things like that. And there's some of the FERA workers showing off their produce, standing in the corn, holding the patty pan squash and the pumpkins and whatever else. And so that is the relief garden of Silverboe County Relief Association. And there's just, Smithers took several pictures showing all the great assortment of things they were growing there, the potatoes, the cabbages, the cauliflower, the parsnips, or carrots, just all the huge variety of vegetables that were growing out there by Hansen Packing. This is also, I just had to throw this in because it was food and it showed up when Barb and Reno Parker were looking for images of food. This says government-owned wheat, and I think it's stamped American Red Cross on the bags. It's kind of hard to see in this big image. But it's an Anaconda Copper Mining Company building that this guy is posed in front of. But this was also part of food relief after the Joshers Club was no longer doing things. And so Silverboe County Relief actually worked along with the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. And they kind of said to people, I mean, it was in the newspapers when they were having a big drive for the Red Cross Sunday, all across the nation. They put big articles on the front page of the Butte paper saying, don't subscribe to the Red Cross, give your money to Silverboe County Relief Agency and it will go to the Red Cross. You'll automatically be a donor to Red Cross by donating to us. So the County Relief Association wanted to, corral everybody that was helping feed the hungry under their domain, the Relief Association. Okay, so now we're out of the Depression years, 1930, and Kiwanis Club, by the way, they don't show up in other things, and the Salvation Army didn't show up in these images that Barb and Reno collected because they were collecting images based on the word food. And so Salvation Army shows out there ringing bells on the streets and stuff like that, but there aren't very many images of them that have the word food tied into it. And so they were very active all through this time. They were probably they didn't have their big building built in the early years of the Joshers Club, but they had a location on Main Street where they were, had a Christmas dinner for 200 needy children in like 1900. But there were no pictures in the Smithers collection of those kinds of things. But Kiwanis Club was often shown, and as were other of the service clubs that were formed, supporting the Salvation Army. So they'll have Kiwanis guys out on the street with the Salvation Army kettles helping collect for it or whatever. But this particular Kiwanis Club thing was, they called them matinees, and they ran every Saturday in December, and every weekend it was a different theater. So I've shown here, December 9th was at the American Theater, and they were showing Mickey Rooney in Little Pal, and it's called the Canned Food Charity Matinee. Admission will be, it says on or more, but it meant 1 or more cans of food. And then the next week they corrected their spelling error, and it does say 1 or more cans of food. But the next week it's at the Rialto Theater, and it's Jane Withers and Gene Autry in Shooting High. And so there was a number of theaters in Butte, and so like 4 weekends in a row, they would be raising money at their canned food drives. And Matt Christie was the president of Kiwanis at the time, and that's his daughter, Marge Christie, and shown in the lobby of the Rialto with all the canned food that's being donated for this food drive. And now we're moving up to the 1950s, and this is these are the only two images I had of strike kitchens in Butte, in the Smithers collection. And so this one, the location of the strike kitchen is in the Creamery Cafe building. This is in 1953, and the signs in the window tell you it's the Miners Union Strike Kitchen, and the men are lined up all the way along the street, waiting to get in and be fed. And the next one is 4 years later, 1957, and I'm not sure what building they're using. You know, it's like the Joshers Club. They would find a building that was vacant at the time, and they would set it up to feed their miners that were striking. And so I don't know if anybody can tell me what building this is the inside of. I'd love to know. But basically, that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about any of these organizations, or if you just have comments you want to throw in. Yes, Jim?
Just a